2 weeks ago, I said that this is a time of year where light and darkness are in great contrast. It's the darkest time of the year as far as the amount of sunlight that we have, the amount of daylight that we have, and it's also a time that we light things up more than we ever do with Christmas lights on our homes and with decorations inside and with the symbolism of candles that we use in our worship service with the Advent wreath and so on and so forth. And I talked 2 weeks ago about how this is a time of year that not only can be physically dark, visually dark, but also can be dark in the soul of many people. It can be a time of discouragement for various reasons, in part because of the short days, but in part also because of other memories or people who are missing, people who are lost, people who are gone out of our lives, who have passed away, or for various other reasons. And that Jesus, his coming that we celebrate at this time of year, is a reminder that even in the deepest darkness that people can experience and go through, God sends his light to bring light to us and to give us hope for the full light that is coming in the future when Jesus returns. That's a huge part of what our celebration of Jesus coming is all about. And of the darkness that there is in some people's hearts and souls. We've talked to some extent about loss, but there's another sort of loss as well. There's another sort of darkness that people experience who are undergoing depression, or even if they're not necessarily undergoing depression, but can be lurking down deep in the hearts and souls and minds of people. And that is self-hatred, self-loathing, not wanting to be in one's own presence, not being happy with what one sees when one looks in the mirror, not believing that there's really anything terribly worthwhile about oneself, comparing oneself to other people or to another standard, and coming up lacking, coming up missing. And there's different reasons that people hate themselves, loathe themselves, don't like themselves, don't like being around themselves, don't like thinking about themselves, but can't stop thinking about themselves. One is guilt, memories of things that they've done in the past, when you've committed sins against God, when you've done things that you know that are wrong, that you're not proud of, when you've harmed other people, and you can't stop thinking about how you did this bad thing to hurt someone that you love. And then also sometimes associated with it, and sometimes independently of it, is shame. By which I mean not measuring up in the sight of other people. As other people are looking at you, as you're looking at yourself, imagining what other people are thinking about you, thinking, I don't compare, I don't measure up, I'm not good enough, I'm a loser, I'm not as good as they are at this or at that or whatever. And so both of those, guilt or shame, combining or generating that self-hatred, is a darkness that so many people suffer under, so many people suffer with. And a guy in the Bible named Paul knew this intimately. Now, some of this is reading between the lines, but we have a lot more lines to read about with Paul than we do with most people. Paul was an early Christian leader, but he didn't start out that way. We have a lot that's about him in the book of Acts in the New Testament, and we have a lot that's written by him in the epistles of the New Testament that he wrote, the letters to various churches that he founded. And though some of this is reading between the lines, we can see that Paul was driven and that he was motivated by this deep underlying discontent and even hatred or frustration or dissatisfaction with himself. We see it that early on, Paul had two names, and we see both of them in the Bible. Paul is a Greek name. It's Paulos. It means short. And Saul, or Saul, Shaul, was his Hebrew name. He was a Jew. And that's the same name as the first king that Israel ever had. You can read about him in 1 Samuel, in the book of 1 Samuel in the Old Testament. And when he was he was a Jew who grew up in the city of Tarsus, in what is today South Central Turkey, but he spent his young adulthood, it would appear, and maybe even his teenage years, we're not sure, in Jerusalem studying. And he was studying among the rabbis there, and he was bent, completely bent and focused on being the most faithful Jew honoring God that he could possibly be. And he was driven to measure up as a Jew, as one of God's chosen people, a member of the people of Israel, driven to measure up before God by keeping all of God's commandments with the utmost rigor and living completely according to the teaching, the Torah, that God gave to Moses and to the interpretation of that Torah that had come from rabbis over the previous few centuries. He was completely focused on that, being a member of the group called the Pharisees, who were completely driven to be pure before God. But he also wanted to measure up then before other Jews. He didn't want there to be any other Jew, any other Pharisee, or any other person who would look at him and think that he wasn't doing his part, that he wasn't pulling his weight, that he wasn't living to the highest possible standards. And his drive within to measure up in righteousness before God and before his people led him to do exactly the wrong thing. Because when some Jews began saying that Jesus of Nazareth was actually the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, whom the leaders of Judaism in Jerusalem had given over to the Romans to crucify, that this one actually rose from the dead, and in doing so was condemning, was passing judgment on the leaders of Judaism, including Paul's very teacher, Gamaliel himself, as being dead wrong, as having actually received the anointed, chosen, promised one of God that he was going to send to his people to deliver them, that they actually had him, didn't recognize him, rejected him, and killed him. This was something that Paul could not take. He could not take that message. He could not take that announcement that salvation came from this one whom they had killed. He could not accept that this one had actually risen from the dead ahead of everybody else in Judaism. He could not accept that. And he could not accept that these Jews who were saying this about Jesus were actually worshiping this Jesus as if he was not only connected with God, but that he was in fact God himself in some way. He could not accept this idolatry. And so in his drivenness to be as righteous and good and perfect as possible, he got authority from the leaders in Jerusalem to round up all of the Jews he could who were proclaiming that Jesus was Messiah, and throwing them into prison, confiscating their goods, beating them, even killing them, to get them to stop. And while he was doing that, he was actually leaving, going from Jerusalem to Damascus, further north in Syria, to find people, Jews who are believing and proclaiming Jesus there. And on his way, Jesus met him. A revelation of a bright light shining from heaven. And he was blinded, and all of the men with him were blinded. And he saw this figure who said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" He said, Who are you, Lord? And he says, "I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting." And this completely turned Saul around. He was completely changed. He realized that his drivenness to measure up got him going 100% in the opposite direction. 180 degrees from the direction he ought to be going. But he learned then, as he turned around, as he realized this Jesus is Messiah, he learned how to overcome guilt. He learned how to overcome those imperfections, those moral imperfections that were driving him. He learned that the way to overcome that guilt at the root of his soul that he was trying to overcome was to take Jesus the Messiah's righteousness, Jesus the Christ's righteousness in place of his own. That rather than overcoming his moral defects by being more exact, by repenting more faithfully, by getting back on and being more deliberate and more careful as he moved forward in repentance in the future, that simply his efforts to repent adequately were not enough. That in fact, it was taking upon himself the record of Jesus, the perfect report card of Jesus, and completely rejecting his own report card, both the bad things and the good things as well, as being irrelevant. That was the way to overcome the guilt in his life. And he also learned how to overcome shame. He learned to take Christ's glory in place of his own. Rather than have his own honor, rather than have his own glory, rather than have his own respect that other people might pay him, to completely reject anything about himself that might be attractive to other people, and also to reject anything about himself that might be unattractive to other people, and simply take the glory of Christ, the glory of Messiah Jesus, to be his own glory. He wrote in the book of Galatians, chapter 2, verse 20, "I have been crucified with Christ. And it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The life that I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and who gave himself up for me." And yet, Saul, or Paul, as he would be known in the places where Greek was predominantly spoken, still struggled. He still struggled. We can still see it on the pages of the New Testament. He was still conscious of his past failure. He was still conscious of the fact that when he was wise in his own eyes, when he was following the best he knew how, it got him going in completely the wrong direction of actually attacking God's very people. He was so conscious of this that he called himself in the book of 1 Timothy the chief of sinners. The chief of sinners, because, he says, I persecuted the church of God. And we actually see then that as he traveled, sent by God to go west through the Roman Empire, through the Mediterranean world, to speak of Jesus where he had not yet been proclaimed among Jews scattered all throughout the Roman Empire, and then also to non-Jews, Gentiles living in those cities also. As he was going in those directions, what he was careful to do was to take a collection, to take money that was contributed wherever he was, to take it back to Jerusalem, back to the very people that he had impoverished by taking their goods, by throwing them into prison. He was making amends for the rest of his ministry wherever he went. In fact, in the book that Vinny read from, 2 Corinthians, there are 2 chapters, chapters 8 and 9, where he talks about raising up part of this collection from the church at Corinth. And every time he was doing that, he was conscious of the fact of his own sin and what he had done. And he was also conscious not only of his past failure, but of his present weakness. He was conscious that at the present time, he didn't measure up in the sight of other people. Being a Jew, he certainly got enough respect among Jews. But when he was living and operating among non-Jews, they despised him for being a Jew. There was every bit as much anti-Semitism in the ancient world as there has been in the modern world. He was cognizant of that. He was a powerful, powerful intellect, a powerful thinker, and you can see that in his writing, but we also have evidence that when he was in somebody's presence and speaking, he was not very impressive. He may have been, well, we know he was. His name was Paulos, short. He was short. He wasn't physically strong, most likely. He wasn't a great athlete, most likely. He was somebody who, when he talked, he said about himself in 1 Corinthians, "When I came to you, I came with weakness and fear and much trembling." He was not a charismatic speaker. He was not highly impressive. He was not attractive and magnetic that people would naturally be drawn to him. He wasn't. And he knew it. We also see after that point where he was blinded by Jesus on that road to Damascus, he seems, and again this is reading between the lines a little bit, but he seems to have had eye problems ever since. There are episodes that take place in the book of Acts where he can't see somebody very clearly. He said to the church in Galatia that when he was with them, he said, "You would have taken out your very eyes and given them to me," because they loved him so much. And we also see that when he finished letters, he would dictate his letters and somebody else would write them down. But at the end of the letter, to demonstrate that it was really him and not a forgery, he would write the last few letters himself. And he actually wrote at the end of Galatians chapter 6, you can see what large letters I'm writing with my own hand. Probably because he couldn't see very well. So he was mostly blind, perhaps. And people knew this. In fact, it might have even been obvious. There might have been problems with his eyes. He might have had some secretion coming out that was kind of gross. We don't really know. But he was conscious of his present weakness. Conscious of his shame before other people. Conscious that in the sight of the other people where he was, he didn't measure up. And so he still struggled with that self-hatred. He still struggled with that self-loathing. I mean, again, it's reading between the lines, but it's there. It's coming out. His drivenness, his desire to work harder than anybody else. As he says in 1 Corinthians 15, yes, I worked harder than all of them, all the other apostles, but no, it wasn't me. It was the grace of God that was in me. He was still driven. And yet in this situation then with the church at Corinth, he faced a situation that could so easily have dredged up all of the self-hatred that he had put to bed in Christ and plunged him back into darkness again. Because Corinth, the church there, a city in southern Greece, this was a church that he had founded. He went there. He was the first person to proclaim the good news of Jesus there. He was the one who brought them into being. They knew him. They knew him well. And yet, before 2 Corinthians was written, they accused him of lying. Because he said that he was going to come and visit them, and before he came and visited them, he went to northern Greece and started there. So they accused him of being dishonest. They accused him of saying one thing and doing something else because of his change of plans. And not only that, but they demanded credentials. We can see earlier in 2 Corinthians 3 and at the end of 2 Corinthians 2, Paul is just beside himself saying, like, you really need letters of recommendation for us? Like you really need, like, from Peter or from John or from James or something, like a letter that we can hand you to prove that we're really an apostle? Like, seriously? Your very existence as Christians is proof that I'm an apostle. Otherwise, how would you even know Jesus in the first place? And some among the Corinthians thought that he was a loser. There were people there who were saying about him, kind of rumoring about him, whispering about him. They're saying, Paul's letters are weighty and powerful, but in person his appearance is unimpressive and his speech is contemptible. This shows up. Paul actually quotes these people later on in 2 Corinthians. And Paul there were people there in Corinth who were impressive, who were good talkers, who were big shots. And there were people in Corinth who were preferring their teaching because it was with the style, with the panache, with the intellect, with the energy that Greek orators were trained to have as entertainers. See, back in those days, philosophers were entertainers. Philosophers were like celebrities. And so to be able to be an orator who could speak wisdom and talk about divine mysteries, that was an impressive thing. And there were people who were sort of pseudo-celebrities there in the church at Corinth that other people were like, we like these guys better. This guy is something. This guy's got it. This guy's got that it factor. He's got that sexiness. We're into it. Paul, though, he doesn't. He's junk. He's a loser compared to these people. I mean, Paul, you can just imagine the hurt. The book of 2 Corinthians is Paul's agonized response to this. It's personal. It's the most personal book that Paul wrote. It's hurt. It's angry. It's sarcastic. Paul is ripped up by the betrayal, by the rejection, by the condemnation of these people. And yet, even within this book, Paul is ever the teacher. And as he writes this book to defend himself, to defend his actions, to explain himself, he's also teaching, because he's pointing out to this church in Corinth the reason that they're looking down on him is revealing a defect in their own understanding of what Jesus is all about and his light in the darkness. Now, how would you feel if you were Paul? Maybe that is how you feel. When you've tried to put aside your memory of guilt, you try to set aside your not measuring up in the sight of other people, and yet then there's a person in your life or a group of people in your life that keep reminding you of it. Maybe on purpose, maybe not on purpose, maybe by comparison with them, maybe because they're more successful than you, maybe because they do accuse you, maybe because they do criticize you, maybe because they are finding fault with you. And how that can dredge up the self-hatred, dredge up the self-loathing, make you think, I really am junk. I really am a loser. I really don't belong. I really have messed everything up. What they're saying about me is true. Well, Paul here in 2 Corinthians, he gives an example of himself, and actually in the entire book he does, but just in this one section we'll see some, an example of what to think to overcome that self-loathing, what to think to get out of that darkness of hating yourself. And I'm going to give you 5 points here today to do that, just 5 simple applications. 5 applications of what Paul says, okay? 5 new thoughts, 5 new actions to take to replace that self-loathing. Now, I'm not going to promise to you that if you do these 5 things that everything is going to work out. I'm not. I'm not going to promise to you if you do these 5 things that therefore your self-hatred, self-loathing, your feelings of guilt and shame will automatically and immediately go away. But I will say that they won't go away without these 5 things. The first thing is get acquitted. The first new action is get acquitted. Get acquitted. Paul talks here about 2 covenants. He talks about a covenant that God made with Israel through Moses. And he refers to this as the covenant of condemnation, the ministry that condemns, the covenant of condemnation. And that covenant was a covenant where God made a deal. He made a covenant with people, with his people, where he said, I will be your God, you will be my people, and he told them what was right and wrong. But he did not place within them the ability to do that right thing. They were still people set in a mode, a fallen, depraved mode of doing their own thing rather than obeying God, of setting themselves up as Lord rather than obeying the true God as Lord. But that's been replaced with a new covenant, with a new deal, with a new approach. And that is the covenant of acquittal, the covenant of justification, the covenant of vindication, the covenant of righteousness. And in this one, it's the same God, and it's the same people, and it's the same right and wrong. But the difference is the right has been already achieved by Jesus, the Son of God, who became a human and who lived it out perfectly. And so now you can take on his report card rather than have your own. His righteousness rather than have your own. And so Paul says, look, if the original service, if the original ministry, if the original person sent from God and what he did, namely Moses, came with glory, how much more will the new ministry of the Spirit in righteousness come with even greater glory than that? He's referring to the fact that when Moses, God's messenger, was leading God's people Israel out of Egypt, they went to Mount Sinai, this mountain in the middle of the desert, and God came down on that mountain in glory and power. It was like a volcano. There's dark clouds, and there's an earthquake, and there's rumbling, and there's thunder, and there's sound of a trumpet, and there's these flashes of light that are coming out of it as God's holy, awesome presence came down on that mountain. And what is so glorious that as Moses was going up to the top of the mountain to talk to God, God could not show him his full glory. The most he could show him, he said, you can't see my face, you can just see my back. That's the most glory you can stand. That's the most you can take. And Paul says if that original covenant came with that much of the revelation of the glory of God, how much of the revelation of the glory of God, the beautiful shining splendor and majesty that is God himself, how much more of that are we going to see in this new deal? Get acquitted. Don't keep living under the old covenant. Don't keep living under the old set of rules where you have to live by the set of rules with moral power that you do not possess. Rather, live in the new deal, in the new covenant, where your righteousness is not coming by your good deeds. Your righteousness is not even coming by how adequately you repent from your bad deeds. Your righteousness is purely coming from the righteousness of Jesus Christ. That's where the source of the new glory is. That's how you get rid of guilt. Get acquitted. Secondly, expect new glory. Expect new glory. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3:18, I'm actually going to show you a different rendering of this because there's some tricky Greek there, and different translations word it in different ways, and there are different ways that things could be rendered. But here's, I think, probably the best way to read this verse. It goes like this. And as all of us look at the mirror image of the glory of the Lord in an uncovered face, we are being transformed into the same image, glory corresponding to glory exactly as that of the Lord, the Spirit. What he's referring to with the uncovered face has to do with Moses, which Paul makes reference to here. If you look in Exodus chapter 34, you don't have to do it now, but just take a note if you want to look at it later. Exodus 34, end of that chapter, we find that Moses, as he was spending this time with God, the glory and radiance and light of God was actually seeping into his skin of his face. So when Moses then returned to talk to the people, his face was literally glowing, and it totally freaked people out. That's actually in the Hebrew, and it totally freaketh people out. That's what it says. It's right there. I mean, they were like, whoa, like, this is not cool. Like, they did not want to look at Moses at all. Not at all. And so what Moses would do is when he was talking with God, he would hear God's commandment to the people, and then he would go and he would talk to the people, and they would see his face shining, and while his face was shining, he would tell them what God said. They would actually be seeing the glory of the Lord reflected in Moses' face while they were hearing the words of the Lord that were coming out of Moses' mouth. And after he said that, he would put a veil over his face so that people could stand to be around him. And then gradually, that radiance would decay. It would wear off over time, until the next time that Moses went back to talk to the Lord. And what Paul is saying here is that we have a new Moses. We have a new messenger. He talks about him here in chapter 4, verse 6. He talks about the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. He says a few verses before, in verse 4, the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, who is the image of God. So when we see this man, Jesus, we're actually seeing God in the flesh. And so we have a new messenger. We have a new Moses. We have a new prophet to lead us. We have a new mediator. We have a new go-between, and it's Jesus. And his is the uncovered face. And so as we look at the face of Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah, we are seeing the glory of God in a mirror image in the face of Jesus. So that the face of Jesus is the face of God the Father. Jesus himself said to one of his disciples, Philip, we read this in John chapter 14, Philip said to Jesus, "Show us the Father." And Jesus said back to him, "Philip, how long have I been with you, and you're asking me to show you the Father? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." And so we see, so the glory of God is reflected in the face of Christ. So as we turn to him and look at Jesus, then his glory bounces off of him and comes into our faces. And we too shine with the glory of God. Coming a corresponding glory from the Father to the Son to you. Bang! Glory. Expect a new glory. Paul says, look, since we have this expectation, verse 12 of chapter 3, verse 12, therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. That word hope is a positive expectation. Since we have this expectation, we are very bold. We are very bold because we expect that the longer we gaze at this image, the longer we are looking at this uncovered face, we are being transformed into the same image, glory corresponding to glory, exactly as that of the Lord the Spirit. Expect, my friends, a new glory. Expect that it's coming. It's coming in the future. Jesus will return and it will be complete. And you will shine with the glory of God, with the beauty of God, with the majesty, with the splendor of God that cannot be shamed. Expect it. Because even now, if you're looking at Jesus for salvation, it's already happening in your life. Expect new glory. Third new thought, third new action, let it all hang out. Let it all hang out. Give full disclosure. Look at what Paul says in chapter 4. He says, look, in verse 2, we have renounced, in verse 1, he says, since we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. We're not discouraged. We're not discouraged despite what you're saying about me. We're not discouraged despite the fact that people don't recognize it and don't get it. We're not discouraged. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We don't use deception, nor do we distort the word of God. On the contrary, by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God. So you see, he's responding to this accusation that he was lying when he said, I'm going to go here, but but then he doesn't go there. He's saying, look, we're not liars. We let it all hang out. We're right out there. Let it all hang out. Give full disclosure. Don't be ashamed. Don't be ashamed of your guilt. Don't be ashamed of your weakness. Don't be ashamed of your vulnerability. Don't be ashamed of not being good enough. Whatever it is that people are thinking you're not good enough, double down on that. Bring that out. Make it plain. Make it open. Make it obvious. Stop hiding. You're not fooling anybody. And as you do that, what is also happening is that not only your weakness is hanging out there, not only your past is hanging out there, but the grace of God in Jesus Christ that's operating in your life is also hanging out there. You cannot show the glory of God unless you're going to show the weakness of self. You cannot show the glory of God unless you're going to show the weakness of self. That's tweetable. If anybody right here is like on their phone right now, go on to Twitter and tweet at Corey Hartman, whatever it was I just said that now I've forgotten. Tweet that. It was really good. You cannot show the glory of God without showing the weakness of self. Because right after what Vinny read, as you look at verse 7, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. I'm going to prevent this from burning up here. So let it all hang out. Let it be there, because as people see the weakness of you that you're not ashamed of and not afraid of and not hiding anymore, they're going to see the glory of God. Number 4, fourth new action to take to counter self-hatred. Accept that some people can't see the glory. Accept it. Accept that some people can't see the glory. Accept that some people are not going to recognize it. They're not going to believe it. They're not going to go for it. They're not going to see it in you. They're going to be confused. They're going to miss out. Paul says in chapter 3, he says, he's basically talking about the irony, the sad irony, that as Moses put that veil over his face so that people wouldn't see the glory, he's saying Moses still has a veil over his face. Moses still has a veil over his face. Because in synagogue after synagogue all around the world, every Sabbath, at the high point of the Sabbath service, the Shabbat service, is Torah service. Where the Har Torah is read, which is a selection from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And then the Haftorah, which is a selection from the prophets that corresponds to that Torah portion. That in that Torah portion, that Moses portion that's read week after week after week after week after week, the people who are hearing it, the people who are reading it, the people who are soaking it in, paying attention to it, trying to shape their lives to live in accordance with what God has said, cannot see the glory of Jesus Christ that all of it's pointing to. Jesus said about himself, Moses wrote about me. Moses, he says that in, I believe, John chapter 7, John chapter 8, toward the end of the chapter. Moses wrote about me. He says, you search the scriptures because in them you think you have life. It's them that speak of me. But if you don't believe in Moses, how are you going to believe what I say? If you don't believe that all of that is pointing to the reality that is right here, right now. So there's still a veil there. And Paul says it's only in the Messiah that that veil is taken away. Only when somebody turns to Jesus as the Messiah can they see in those 5 books of Moses, oh my goodness, he's there all along. He's right there all along. He's been right in front of my face, and I haven't seen him. But it's not only Jews who have this issue. Non-Jews have the very same issue. It's the very same issue. People who've been raised as Christians have the very same issue. Right? Because he says, look, in chapter 4, verse 4, or verse 3, and even if our gospel, our good news is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age, that's the devil, has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. They can't see it. They hear the notes, but they can't recognize the music. You know, they see the shapes, but they don't perceive the image. They don't recognize them. They don't recognize the reality of this. And so as you're there, as you're putting yourself out there, there are people who are not going to see it, and you've got to accept that. Paul did. He didn't like it, but he accepted that this is real, sadly. And he recognized that as you do put yourself out there, as you do let it all hang out, as you do promote Jesus in your life, that people who don't recognize Jesus will think you're just promoting yourself. They'll think you're just a flagrant self-promoter. He says, look, you know, in verse 5, we do not preach ourselves, but Jesus Christ is Lord. And he's talking to Christians. He's talking to people who actually should know better, who are thinking that Paul is just about promoting himself. And Paul's saying the reason you're thinking that I'm promoting myself is because you're obsessed with promoting yourselves. And you think I'm just like you, but I'm not. But we got to accept, you got to accept that some people can't see the glory that is in you. And rather than take their condemnation of you as real, you take the glory that God has given you as real, and you accept that some people are not going to see that. Fifth and finally, promote Jesus. Go beyond the choice of self-hatred versus self-promotion. Go beyond the choice of I either hate myself, I either think I'm bad, I either think I'm defective, I either think I'm terrible, or I think that I'm great, and I think that I'm wonderful, and I think I have marvelous winning qualities, and I think that I'm a good person, and I pat myself on the back with all this self-esteem. That's a false choice. They're both dead because they're both about self. Both self-hatred and self-promotion are dead because they're about self, but there's a third way, and that's Jesus' promotion. And that's saying there really is no me anymore. There really is no success or failure in me anymore. There really is no good, bad in me anymore. That's kind of all beside the point. It's all Jesus. And Jesus is good and Jesus is right. I invite you today to make Jesus, the image of God, your image. To make him the light, transform your darkness. Transform and light up what is within. You may be down, you may be low, you may be blue, you may be sad. And that might not all turn around right away, even if you put these things into practice. But if you gaze on the face of Jesus Christ and see his glory, you too will be transformed into ever-increasing glory that is from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So take in your bulletins this card that we put every week, and I'd like us all together to tear it. And I'd like us all together to take the side that says First Baptist Church and all together to flip that over and all together to look at those things that are there, those options of what the Lord is calling you to do today. And one of them there, the third one down, is an invitation prayer. That's where you pray that you have somebody to invite to Jesus himself. But the first two are about turning to Jesus for the first time or for the who knows how manyth time, to come to him and to be renewed, to be restored, and to be saved. And when you've checked a box there that is your reminder, a commitment to yourself, and you put that in your pocket to save that, take the other side and please write your name on that so that Ann Logue, our administrative assistant, knows you're here. It's very helpful to her because otherwise she just has to try to remember. And she's a brilliant, brilliant woman, but let's not tax her any more than we absolutely have to. And put any contact information you'd like to share with us there. And then on the flip side, anything you'd like to share with me, I take these, I read them, and I do respond. And I love to hear them. And if I've gotten one and I haven't responded, then please do it again so that in case I lost it. But I don't normally lose it. And as you're doing this, Kelly's going to play. And when you've had that time with the Lord one-on-one, let's sing along this song.